Welcome to African Folktales by Mazi. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on your notification. Then tell us where you are watching at the comments section. Fence it close, listen well, and open your heart. For this is not just a story. It is a warning carried by time, whispered by broken walls and empty pews. It is the kind of story elders tell when the fire burns low and silence grows heavy, long before the church fell. Before the windows shattered and grass claimed the altar, there stood a house of worship called the House of Everlasting Light. Its bell rang every Sunday, and its songs traveled far across the land. People said heaven listened when this church prayed. At the center of it all was a pastor many believed was chosen by God. His name was Pastor Samuel Adeyemi. He spoke softly, not like a man chasing power, but like one carrying wisdom. His voice calmed storms inside broken hearts. His prayers made people weep. When he spoke of truth, the congregation believed him without question. In those days, the church was full of laughter and faith. Mothers sang with their children. Fathers lifted tired hands in hope. Strangers became family. The poor felt seen. The wounded felt safe. And everyone believed this place would stand forever. But African elders say something important. When truth is buried, it does not die, it waits. There were signs, small at first. Late-night meetings with closed doors. Questions that never received clear answers. Smiles that came too quickly. Files locked away. Words spoken that sounded holy, yet felt heavy. Still, the people trusted. Respect for spiritual leaders runs deep in our land. To question a pastor felt like questioning God himself. So doubts were swallowed. Silence became a habit. I was there. I saw it all. My name is Daniel, and for 10 years, this church was my second home. I believed. I followed. I defended. But today, only ruins remain, and if Pastor Samuel had told the truth just once, this church would still exist. In African elders say that before a great tree falls, its roots cry out beneath the soil. At the House of Everlasting Light, those cries were quiet, but they were there. The first sign came with a vision. One Sunday morning, Pastor Samuel stood before the congregation and said God had spoken to him in the night. He said the church would grow beyond its walls. He said a bigger building was needed, a place where generations would worship. His voice was gentle, and his eyes shone with passion. The people shouted with joy. Giving began that same day. Women dropped savings they had hidden for years into the offering basket. Men promised parts of their monthly wages. Some youths sold phones and clothes to contribute. We believed we were building something eternal. I remember the sound of coins and notes falling together. It sounded like faith. Construction started quickly. Sand was delivered. Blocks were stacked. Workers sang as they labored. Each Sunday, Pastor Samuel gave updates. At first, everything seemed fine. Then small problems appeared. One week, the workers did not show up. Another week, materials were missing. A month passed, and only half the foundation was complete. When people asked questions, Pastor Samuel smiled and said delays were normal. Even Noah faced mockery before the rain, he told us. We nodded and clapped, but the delays continued. Late one evening, I stayed behind to arrange chairs. As I walked past the pastor's office, I saw light under the door. Inside, Pastor Samuel sat alone. His Bible lay open, but he was not reading. Papers covered his desk. His hands shook as he pressed them against his forehead. For a moment, he looked like a man drowning. When he noticed me, he stood quickly and smiled. Go home, Daniel, he said. All is well. I wanted to ask questions, but my mouth stayed closed. Soon, elders began to whisper among themselves. The money records did not match. Receipts were missing. When one elder asked for clarity, Pastor Samuel spoke of trust and unity. Division destroys churches, he warned softly. No one pushed further. In our culture, respect is heavy. We chose silence, but silence, like a closed pot on fire, only builds pressure. And one day, it always bursts. African elders teach that when a drum changes its sound, the dancer must look at the skin. The church drum still beat loudly, but something in its rhythm had shifted. Testimonies became more dramatic. A woman claimed her sickness vanished overnight. A man said debts disappeared without explanation. Each story brought louder shouts and longer offerings. Yet some testimonies sounded too perfect, as if rehearsed. Once, I saw a woman reading from a small paper before walking to the altar. When she noticed me watching, She quickly folded it and smiled. Later, she whispered to me. They said it would encourage faith. That was when doubt first sat heavily in my chest. Pastor Samuel began preaching more about obedience than truth. He warned against questioning spiritual authority. A sheep that wanders gets eaten, he said calmly. People nodded, afraid to be that sheep. Fear wore the clothes of faith, and many did not notice the difference. The building project stalled completely. Grass grew around the foundation. Workers stopped coming. Rumors spread, but they were always quickly buried under prayer meetings and fasting programs. Each time pressure rose, Pastor Samuel announced another spiritual battle. We fasted, we prayed, we waited. One night, an emergency elders meeting was called. I was asked to take notes. Inside the room, voices were low but tense. An elder asked directly where the remaining funds were. The room went silent. Pastor Samuel closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and said, God is testing our loyalty. No figures were shown. No records were shared. That night, I could not sleep. My mind replayed his words again and again. Loyalty, trust, faith. But where was truth? The following Sunday, Pastor Samuel preached about honesty. His words were strong, but his eyes avoided the congregation. Sweat rolled down his face. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the Bible. I felt a strange fear, like standing under a tree during a storm. After the service, a stranger appeared. He was tall, dark-skinned, and dressed simply. He carried a thin brown envelope under his arm. He did not greet anyone. He walked straight to the elders and asked for a private meeting. Minutes later, shouting broke out behind closed doors. The doors opened suddenly. Elders rushed out, faces pale like ash. Pastor Samuel followed, slower, quieter. The stranger stepped forward and faced the congregation. His voice was calm but firm. This church was built on a lie, he said. The envelope opened. Papers spilled out. Bank statements. Signed agreements, proof. Pastor Samuel said nothing. And in that silence, the truth finally breathed. In African stories, truth does not shout. It waits for silence. When the stranger finished speaking, the church fell quiet in a way I had never known. No one cried. No one prayed. Even the children stopped moving. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath. The stranger introduced himself as Mr. Collard, an auditor sent by a charity organization that had once partnered with the church. His words were simple, but each one cut deep. Funds meant for the building project had been redirected. Donations had been moved through hidden accounts. Reports had been altered. Signatures had been forged. As he spoke, elders looked at one another in disbelief. Some shook their heads. Others covered their mouths. A few stepped back as if distance could protect them from what they were hearing. All eyes turned to Pastor Samuel. He stood at the altar where he had preached for years. His shoulders slumped. The calm man we knew was gone. In his place stood someone older, heavier, and afraid. When an elder begged him to speak, he opened his mouth, but no words came out. That silence hurt more than any confession. Someone shouted, "Is it true?" Another cried, "Say something." Pastor, a woman fainted. The choir members clutched each other. Faith cracked openly that day. Finally, Pastor Samuel spoke, his voice low and broken. He did not deny the accusations. He said he had meant well. He said pressure had pushed him. He said the church needed money to grow faster. He said one lie had led to another. But African wisdom teaches this: a lie told for good still poisons the water. The service ended without prayer. People walked out slowly, as if leaving a burial ground. Outside, arguments broke out. Some defended the pastor. Others cursed him. Many just cried. That night, messages spread like wildfire. Videos leaked. Screenshots appeared. The church became the talk of the city. By morning, members were leaving in groups. Donations stopped. Meetings were canceled. Elders resigned. The building project was abandoned. Pastor Samuel locked himself in his house. He did not answer calls. He did not come to church the next Sunday. And just like that, the house once filled with light began to fall into shadow. African elders say that when a river changes its path, the land around it suffers before it heals. After the truth came out, the church became that broken land. The following Sunday, the gates of the house of everlasting light were open, but the seats were mostly empty. Where there had once been hundreds, only a few dozen sat scattered like lost sheep. Their songs were weak. Their prayers felt unsure. Faith no longer flowed freely. The elders gathered at the altar and announced that Pastor Samuel was stepping aside for a time. They spoke carefully, choosing words like people walking on broken glass. Some members nodded in agreement. Others stood up and walked out without looking back. Outside, the church walls heard angry voices. Some people demanded refunds. Others cried about sacrifices they had made. Families argued on the way home. Friendships broke. Trust shattered. I stayed behind after the service, sitting alone in the back row. I looked at the pulpit where Pastor Samuel once stood with confidence. Now it felt empty, like a throne abandoned after a war. That week, I decided to visit him. His house was quiet. Curtains were drawn. When he finally opened the door, he looked nothing like the man I knew. His beard was untrimmed. His eyes were sunken. His shoulders bent forward as if shame itself was heavy. "I never wanted this," he said before I could speak. He told me the truth then, the full truth. How the pressure to grow the church had eaten at him. How comparing himself to other pastors made him feel small. How one life felt easier than admitting failure. How fear kept him trapped. "I should have told the truth from the beginning," he whispered. "Now it is too late." I left his house with a heavy heart. Weeks passed. Attendance dropped further. The charity demanded its money back. Legal letters arrived. The church account was frozen. Electricity was cut. Water stopped running. Programs were canceled one by one. Soon, weeds began growing around the unfinished building. Paint peeled. Chairs gathered dust. The bell stopped ringing. The church did not close with noise or fire. It faded slowly, like a story no one wanted to hear anymore. And every time I passed by, one thought returned again and again: if only the pastor had told the truth. This place would still exist. In African, when a village shrine falls, the elders do not rush to rebuild. They first ask how the spirit was offended. The house of everlasting light stood the same way, silent, wounded, waiting. After Pastor Samuel stepped away, the elders tried to hold the church together. They rotated preaching duties. They called prayer meetings for healing and restoration. They asked members to forgive and remain faithful. But trust, once broken, does not return just because it is invited. Each Sunday, fewer people came. Those who remained sat far apart, eyes low, voices unsure. The joy that once filled the air was gone. Worship felt forced, like smiles worn for visitors who no longer came. Offerings dropped so low that even basic needs could not be met. Rumors continued to spread outside the church walls. Some said the pastor had stolen millions. Others said the elders were also involved. Each new story made the wound deeper. Even people who once defended the church grew tired of explaining. One afternoon, I met Sister Grace, a woman who had been in the church from the beginning. Her hair had turned gray inside those walls. She looked at the empty hall and shook her head. "A church is not just bricks," she said softly. "It is trust. When trust dies, the building becomes only a shell." Legal trouble soon followed. Letters arrived demanding repayment of funds. Meetings were held with lawyers. Elders argued among themselves. Some resigned quietly. Others accused one another. Unity vanished. Pastor Samuel did not return. He sent one short message to the elders, asking for forgiveness and prayers. He said he needed time to heal. Many read the message in silence. Some wept. Others felt anger rise again. By the end of the year, the gates were locked. Dust settled on the altar. Birds nested in broken windows. Rain leaked through the roof. Children passing by asked what the building once was, and no one answered. In African wisdom, a fallen leader teaches louder than a successful one. The church became a lesson people whispered. Abutho pride can blind. How fear can trap. How one hidden truth can destroy many lives. And still, whenever I walked past that silent place, the same words echoed in my heart. Heavy and clear: if only the pastor had told the truth, even once, this story would have ended differently. African elders say that after a great fall, the land remembers longer than the people. Even when the gates of the church were locked, its story continued to walk among us. Months passed, but the name House of Everlasting Light still stirred strong feelings. Some people spoke of it with anger, others with shame, a few with deep sadness. No one spoke of it with pride anymore. Former members scattered to different churches. Some stopped attending church entirely. They said faith had wounded them too deeply. Others carried suspicion wherever they went, watching pastors closely, listening for hidden meanings behind every sermon. I carried guilt, many times. I replayed moments in my Minda late-night meetings. The missing records, the tired look in Pastor Samuel's eyes. I wondered what would have happened if I had spoken earlier, if any of us had. But in African stories, regret always comes after wisdom. Never before, one afternoon, I returned to the old church building alone. The gate creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled of dust and damp wood. Sunlight slipped through broken windows, lighting the altar where prayers once rose like smoke. I sat in the front row and closed my eyes. I remembered the laughter, the songs, the promises. I remembered believing that this place could never fail, that our pastor could never lie. Then I understood something painful, but true. Faith placed in a man instead of truth is a fragile thing. As I stood to leave, I noticed a small notebook on the floor near the pulpit. Its pages were worn. Inside were Pastor Samuel's handwritten notes and finished sermons, prayers filled with fear, questions he never answered. One line stood out, written again and again: "Tell the truth before it destroys everything." My chest tightened. Pastor Samuel had known. He had always known. I closed the notebook gently and placed it back where I found it. Some lessons are not meant to be carried away. They are meant to remain where the mistake was made. As I walked out, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the broken floor. The building stood silent, but its message was loud. In African folktales, ruins are teachers. They warn those who come after. And this ruin whispered a warning I would never forget. When truth is delayed, destruction arrives on time. The following weeks felt heavy. Word of the church's collapse spread through the city like wildfire. People whispered in markets, on buses, at school gates. Even distant relatives who had never entered the church spoke of Pastor Samuel and the missing money. Some defended him, saying he had meant well, but most could not stop shaking their heads. The name of the church had become a story of caution rather than hope. I walked the streets, noticing faces that once smiled at me in fellowship now looked with suspicion or pity. I wondered how many lives had been changed, not for the better, but for the lessons learned too late. One evening, I received a letter slipped under my door. It was written in Pastor Samuel's handwriting, shaky yet deliberate. He wrote of regret, of prayers for forgiveness, and of warnings about pride and silence. "I hid the truth," he said, "and for that, many suffered. If only I had spoken earlier, the church would still exist." I held the paper and felt the weight of his words pressing down. His confession did not erase the damage, but it painted a picture of a man trapped by fear and expectation. I thought of the children who once ran through the aisles, of families who had trusted blindly, of elderly members who had prayed with all their hearts. None of them deserved the fall. Yet, life moves on, even when faith stumbles. The streets were quiet as I walked back past the church. Its broken windows glinted in the setting sun. I realized something else. The church had become more than a building. It had become a story that demanded to be remembered. People needed to know what happens when truth is hidden and when leaders choose fear over honesty. That night, I sat and wrote down everything I had seen, heard, and felt. Every late-night meeting, every unanswered question, every moment when doubt whispered and silence was chosen. I wrote so that the next generation might learn, so that they might ask questions and demand truth, so that another church would not die in silence. In African folktales, stories are vessels. They carry warnings across time, from one listener to another. The house of everlasting light had fallen, but its story was alive. Its message was clear. When leaders hide truth, even the strongest faith can crumble, and no prayer can rebuild what dishonesty destroys. Every detail, every meeting, every sermon, every hesitation that had contributed to the fall, I recorded it carefully. African folktales often begin with "listen well," and I wanted this story to be one that warned others. I wanted it to travel from mouth to ear, from generation to generation, so that leaders and followers alike could understand the cost of hidden truth. One afternoon, I returned to the church, now overgrown with weeds and silence. The broken windows reflected the sky above, and the altar, cracked and dust-covered, seemed almost alive in its emptiness. I walked through the pews, imagining the families, the children, the laughter that had once filled the space. Each memory weighed on me like a stone in the chest. I found a hymn book still lying open, its pages yellowed and curling. I brushed off the dust and read the lines aloud softly, words about hope, faith, and honesty. The irony was bitter. The lessons of those words had been ignored, and the consequences were clear. That night, I realized something crucial. the story of the church was more than a tale of one man's failure. It was a warning about faith without scrutiny, trust without truth, and devotion without discernment. And as I walked home under the moonlit sky, the same thought returned, unwavering. If only the pastor had told the truth, the church would still exist. Time moved slowly, but the story of the House of Everlasting Light did not fade. Even as other churches thrived, people whispered about what had happened there. Parents warned children to pay attention to leaders, to ask questions, and to never blindly trust someone, no matter how kind or powerful they seemed. I became a messenger of that lesson, sharing the story quietly with friends, neighbors, and anyone who would listen. One afternoon, I visited Sister Grace. She had stayed close to the church ruins, tending small gardens and helping neighbors. Her eyes, though lined with age, still held the wisdom of those who had survived betrayal. "Daniel," she said, "people forget lessons if they are not told." The pastor's silence destroyed more than bricks. It destroyed belief itself. "We must carry the story," I nodded. That evening, I walked past the old church once again. The setting sun painted long orange streaks across the broken walls, highlighting the cracks and shattered windows. It was hauntingly beautiful. I thought of all the Sundays we had worshipped there, the sermons that had lifted hearts, the prayers that had felt so alive. And yet, I could not forget the hidden truths, the small lies, the secrets that had slowly poisoned everything. Later, I met a small group of former elders and church members at a local cafe. We spoke openly for the first time without fear of judgment. Each person shared their regrets, their memories, their hope for healing. We talked about accountability, about honesty, and about rebuilding faith in ways that could not be easily broken again. That night, I wrote again in my notebook, careful to record not only the mistakes but the lessons. In African folktales, storytellers remind listeners that ruin is often a teacher in disguise. The House of Everlasting Light had fallen, yes, but its story carried warnings for those who would listen. And as the moon rose over the city, I whispered silently, if only the pastor had told the truth, the church would still exist. The story of the House of Everlasting Light began to spread beyond the city. People from nearby towns spoke of the church, the pastor, and the lessons learned from silence and fear. Some came to see the ruins for themselves, peering through broken windows and stepping carefully over weeds that had claimed the floor. I walked among them one afternoon, watching faces filled with curiosity, sadness, and sometimes disbelief. One young man approached me, asking why the church had fallen. I told him simply, truth was hidden. Fear took the place of honesty. And when lies are allowed to grow, even faith cannot survive. He nodded slowly, absorbing the words. I thought of Pastor Samuel, the man whose fear and pride had started it all. I wondered if he had found peace, or if the weight of what he had done haunted him still. Perhaps he, too, had become a cautionary tale. Months later, I received a letter from him. His handwriting was steady now, less shaky than before. He wrote that he had moved to a small village to live quietly, to pray, and to seek forgiveness. He admitted his mistakes fully, and he asked me to share the story so that others could learn. I carried the letter with me, reading it often. Its words were painful, but necessary, a reminder that even good intentions cannot replace honesty. That night, I visited the ruins one more time. The wind whispered through the broken walls, lifting the dust in soft clouds. I imagined the voices of those who had once sung and prayed here. I remembered the faces of families, children, and elders who had trusted blindly. And I knew that the story must live on. In African folktales, elders say that ruins are teachers, and lessons buried in silence are more dangerous than storms. The House of Everlasting Light had fallen, but its message remained, powerful and clear. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I whispered to myself once more, heavy with truth, if only the pastor had told the truth, the church would still exist. Years passed, and the city changed around the House of Everlasting Light. New buildings rose, new churches opened, and people moved on. Yet the story of what had happened there never left those who had witnessed it. I often walked past the ruins, noticing how nature slowly reclaimed the space. Grass grew tall through cracks in the floor. Vines climbed the broken walls. Birds nested in shattered windows. The building seemed alive in its silence, speaking without words, reminding anyone who would listen of the cost of hidden truth. One afternoon, a group of young pastors visited the site. They were curious, eager to learn from history. I guided them through the church, pointing to the cracked altar, the dusty hymn books, the empty pews. This place, I told them, was once full of hope and faith. It fell because fear replaced honesty and silence replaced truth. Let it teach you, so your congregations do not suffer the same fate. The young pastors listened carefully, some taking notes, others staring quietly at the ruins. One of them asked, "Do you think people can ever fully trust again?" I paused. "Trust," I said, "is fragile. It can be rebuilt, but it must always be guided by truth. Without truth, faith is only a shadow of itself." That night, I sat under a tree near the church, watching the stars. The wind carried the faintest echoes of old songs, memories of laughter, prayers, and devotion. I thought of Pastor Samuel, now living quietly in another village. Perhaps he prayed daily, carrying the lessons of his mistakes. Perhaps he had found some peace. But the city would always remember, and the story would continue to warn. In African folktales, ruins teach stronger lessons than towers or palaces. The House of Everlasting Light was no longer a building, but it was alive in memory, a teacher of caution, humility, and the power of truth. And as I turned to leave, I whispered, the words still heavy in my heart, if only the pastor had told the truth, the church would still exist. Even as years passed, the House of Everlasting Light remained a story people could not forget. Travelers who passed through the city often asked about the ruined building, curious about why it had fallen. Former members still whispered warnings to anyone willing to listen: do not follow blindly. Ask questions. Seek truth before faith. I became one of the keepers of that story, guiding people through the lessons the church had left behind. One afternoon, I met a young woman named Amaka, curious and thoughtful, who had heard the story from her parents. She asked, "Did Pastor Samuel ever recover? Did anyone forgive him?" I looked at her, the sun casting long shadows through the broken windows, and said, "He lived quietly, seeking forgiveness. But the church, our faith in that place, cannot be returned. Some things, once broken, remain lessons rather than possessions." She nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of my words. We walked together among the overgrown pews, pointing to remnants of hymn books and journals, each a fragment of memory. Birds flew through the windows, and the wind carried whispers, as if the building itself remembered its glory and its downfall. Later, I spoke to elders who had survived the collapse emotionally and spiritually. They admitted that their loyalty had blinded them, that their fear had allowed secrets to grow unchecked. "We were all part of it," one elder said quietly, "not because we lied, but because we did not speak." His words echoed in my mind long after I left. That evening, I climbed the steps to the old pulpit, touching its splintered wood. I imagined the sermons that had once lifted spirits and the silence that had killed faith. In African folktales, elders teach that silence is as powerful as words, sometimes more dangerous. The House of Everlasting Light had fallen not just from lies, but from the silence of all who could have spoken. And as the sun set behind the ruins, I whispered once again, heavy with memory and warning, if only the pastor had told the truth, the church would still exist. The city slowly rebuilt itself, but the story of the House of Everlasting Light traveled far beyond its streets. People spoke of it in hushed tones at markets, at family gatherings, and in neighboring villages. Parents told their children about the dangers of blind trust, about the importance of asking questions, and about the cost of hidden truths. I continued to walk past the ruins almost daily, watching nature reclaim the building. Grass grew thick between the broken pews, vines wrapped around shattered windows, and birds nested along the edges of the crumbling roof. The silence of the place spoke louder than words ever could. One afternoon, I met a small group of young congregants who had been too young to remember the church's fall. They were curious, eager to understand what had happened. I walked them through the overgrown floor, showing them the cracked altar, the dusty hymn books, and the remnants of sermons. "This church fell," I said, "not because of one man alone, but because we all allowed fear and silence to replace truth. Remember that." They listened quietly, eyes wide, taking in every word. Later, I returned to Pastor Samuel, who now lived far from the city. He had changed. The fire in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by quiet humility and reflection. "I still think about what I could have done differently," he admitted. "But no matter my regrets, the consequences remain. I understood then that confession alone does not heal. Action, accountability, and courage are required, and even then, some damage cannot be undone." That evening, as the sun dipped low, I walked past the ruins once more. Shadows stretched long across the cracked floors, highlighting the fragments of faith and hope that had once filled the church. I thought of all the families, all the elders, and all the children who had loved this place and were forever changed by hidden truth. And as the wind whispered through broken windows, I felt the lesson deeply. Truth cannot wait. Silence only magnifies consequences. And I whispered one final time into the quiet ruins, if only the pastor had told the truth, the church would still exist. Even as the years passed, the House of Everlasting Light held a strange power over the city. Its ruins had become a place of reflection for some, a cautionary tale for others. People who had once worshipped there would stop and stare at the broken walls, as if searching for the echoes of sermons long gone. I continued to walk the streets nearby, listening to whispers of the past and noticing how the story had shaped the way people thought about faith and leadership. One afternoon, a young man named Tund approached me. He had recently become a pastor at a small community church and wanted to learn from the mistakes of the past. "Daniel," he asked, "how can I lead without repeating their errors?" I looked at the overgrown building and replied, "Lead with truth. Speak openly. Fear has no place where faith is built. Remember that honesty keeps trust alive. Deception destroys it." Tund nodded slowly, understanding the weight of the lesson. Later, I met a group of elders who had once managed church affairs. Their faces were lined with guilt and regret. They admitted that they had ignored small warning signs, that their silence had allowed fear and lies to grow unchecked. "We thought obedience was faith," one elder confessed. "We were wrong. True faith is rooted in truth." That evening, I sat on the broken steps outside the church, watching the sunset over the city. The wind carried faint echoes of prayers and songs, ghosts of what had once been. I thought of Pastor Samuel, the congregation, and the countless lessons buried in silence. In African folktales, elders teach that ruins are the greatest teachers. They speak louder than temples, palaces, or grand sermons. The House of Everlasting Light had fallen, yes, but its story was alive, echoing across time. And as darkness fell, I whispered once more, heavy with warning and memory, if only the pastor had told the truth, the church would still exist. Time had a way of softening memories, but the story of the House of Everlasting Light remained sharp for those who had lived it. People spoke of it in markets, at bus stops, and in quiet corners of their homes. The tale had become a warning passed from one generation to another. I often returned to the ruins, watching nature reclaim the space. Grass had grown taller, vines snaked across the walls, and the altar, though cracked, still seemed to reach upward, as if holding on to the faith that once filled it. One afternoon, I saw a small group of children playing near the gates. They asked me about the building, curious about its history. I knelt and told them, this was once a church full of hope, but fear and silence allowed lies to grow. Remember that faith must always be paired with truth. Their eyes widened as they listened. Later, I walked to the top of the altar steps and thought of Pastor Samuel. He had admitted his mistakes, sought forgiveness quietly, and yet he could not undo the damage. Families had been hurt, friendships broken, and hope delayed. Even the elders, who had tried to hold the church together, admitted their silence had been their undoing. That night, I wrote in my notebook, carefully recounting every detail of what had occurred, the hidden funds, the missing records, the sermons that avoided questions, the fearful obedience of the congregation, and the consequences that followed. African elders say that stories are vessels for lessons, and ruins carry the loudest warnings. The House of Everlasting Light had fallen, but its message traveled farther than any sermon ever could. It was a reminder that truth cannot be postponed, silence magnifies consequences, and faith alone cannot rebuild what dishonesty destroys. As the moon rose over the broken building, I whispered into the night, heavy with memory and warning, if only the pastor had told the truth, the church would still exist. The years went by, but the story of the House of Everlasting Light refused to fade. People who had once attended came back, not to pray, but to remember. They told their children, neighbors, and friends about what had happened, emphasizing the importance of truth in leadership. The church had become more than a building. It was a lesson in accountability, a monument to mistakes made in silence. I often walked through the overgrown aisles, touching the dusty hymn books and broken pews. Each fragment carried a memory, the laughter of children, the prayers of families, the hope that once filled the air. I thought of Pastor Samuel, who now lived quietly in a distant village. Rumor said he spent his days praying and reflecting, trying to make sense of his mistakes. But even his personal redemption could not repair what had been broken in the hearts of the congregation. One evening, A young woman approached me near the church ruins. She said she had heard the story from her grandmother and wanted to know how it had all gone wrong. I told her about hidden funds, unanswered questions, fear disguised as faith, and the danger of loyalty without scrutiny. Her eyes were wide as she listened, and I saw in her the understanding that lessons learned too late can still prevent future mistakes. That night, I walked through the ruins alone. The wind whispered through shattered windows, carrying faint echoes of hymns that once filled the air. I thought about families torn apart, about elders who had failed to act, and about a pastor trapped in fear. In African folktales, ruins are teachers, and their lessons linger longer than any living voice. The house of everlasting light had fallen, but it still spoke, reminding all who listen that truth cannot wait, and silence can destroy even the strongest faith. And as I stepped away from the broken altar, I whispered, heavy with memory and warning, if only the pastor had told the truth, the church would still exist. Even after decades, the house of everlasting light continued to teach its lesson. People who had never attended still knew the story, passed down by parents, neighbors, and friends. Its ruins became a place for quiet reflection, a warning to leaders and followers alike. I often walked past the building, watching vines climb the cracked walls and birds nest in the broken windows. The altar, though dusty and worn, still seemed to reach upward, as if holding on to the faith it had once carried. One afternoon, a small group of young pastors visited. They were eager to learn from the mistakes of the past. I guided them through the ruins, pointing out remnants of hymn books, journals, and the altar. This church fell, I said, because fear replaced truth, and silence replaced accountability. Let it teach you, so your congregations do not suffer the same fate. They listened intently, absorbing every word. Later, I met a few former elders who had stayed in the city. They admitted that their loyalty had blinded them, that they had chosen silence over confronting hidden lies. We thought obedience was faith, one elder confessed quietly, but true faith is built on honesty. That evening, I returned to the old church alone. The sunset painted the ruins in golden light, highlighting the cracks and shadows of what had been. I thought about Pastor Samuel, who now lived quietly far away, carrying the burden of his mistakes. I thought of families whose faith had been shaken and trust broken. In Africa, elders say that ruins are the strongest teachers, reminding everyone that silence has consequences, and lies, even small ones, can destroy what prayers cannot save. And as darkness fell over the broken church, I whispered, heavy with memory and warning. The story of the House of Everlasting Light traveled beyond the city, reaching nearby towns and villages. People shared it as a warning. Faith without truth can crumble, and silence can destroy even the strongest communities. I often guided travelers, young pastors, and curious listeners through the ruins. They walked slowly, touching the broken pews, reading the faded hymn books, and imagining the families who had once filled the church with song and prayer. One afternoon, a man approached me, carrying an old photograph of the congregation. He asked, "Did anyone ever try to rebuild?" I shook my head. No building could restore the trust that was lost. Even if walls were erected, the foundation of honesty was gone. He looked down at the photograph, tracing faces with his finger. "And yet," he said softly, "the lesson remains." That night, I sat under the shadow of the church, listening to the wind whistle through broken windows. I thought of Pastor Samuel, who now lived a quiet, reflective life. He had confessed, sought forgiveness, and prayed endlessly, but he could not undo what had been lost. The elders, once proud and loyal, carried the weight of silence with them. The congregation, scattered and wary, learned the hard way that devotion without scrutiny is fragile. In African folktales, elders say that ruins are louder than sermons. They teach lessons that cannot be ignored, lessons that linger long after voices have faded. The House of Everlasting Light had become more than a building. It was a teacher, a warning, and a story that traveled farther than any sermon could. And as the moonlight fell upon its broken walls, I whispered once more, heavy with memory and warning, if only the pastor had told the truth, the church would still exist. Even as decades passed, the House of Everlasting Light stood as a symbol, not of grandeur, but of lessons learned too late. Nature had fully claimed the building, vines wrapped tightly around walls, grass grew high through cracks in the floor, and birds nested among the shattered windows. Yet despite its brokenness, the church continued to speak, louder than ever, to those willing to listen. One afternoon, I guided a group of young leaders through the ruins. Their eyes widened as they traced the cracks in the altar, read faded hymn books, and imagined the families who once filled the building with song. I told them the story, from the hidden funds to Pastor Samuel's fear, to the elders' silence, to the congregation's heartbreak. This church fell, I said, not because faith was weak, but because honesty was missing. Let this place teach you the value of truth in leadership. They listened in silence, some taking notes, others staring thoughtfully at the remnants around them. Later, I walked alone through the church as the sun began to set. Dust rose beneath my feet, shimmering in the golden light. I thought of Pastor Samuel, still living quietly in another village, carrying the weight of his mistakes. I thought of every family that had trusted blindly, every elder who had failed to act, and every child who had believed without question. In African folktales, elders teach that ruins are not empty, they are vessels of wisdom, reminders of what happens when silence and lies are allowed to grow. The house of everlasting light had become that vessel. It no longer rang with prayers or songs, but its message traveled farther than any sermon ever could. And as the shadows stretched long across the broken altar, I whispered once more, heavy with memory and warning, if only the pastor had told the truth, the church would still exist. The final chapter of the House of Everlasting Light is not about walls, pews, or sermons. It is about memory, truth, and the lessons that endure. Even as the city thrived around it, the ruins stood silent, but speaking louder than ever. Travelers, young leaders, and curious villagers came to see the place, tracing the cracks in the altar, reading the faded hymn books, and imagining the laughter, the prayers, and the hope that had once filled it. I often walked among the broken pews, thinking about Pastor Samuel, whose fear and pride had triggered the fall. He had confessed, sought forgiveness, and lived quietly, yet he could not undo the heartbreak, the broken trust, and the lost faith of the congregation. Elders had learned, painfully, that loyalty without honesty is fragile, and the congregation had discovered that blind devotion without questions leaves hearts vulnerable. I led groups through the ruins, sharing the story repeatedly, emphasizing the value of truth, courage, and transparency. Faith without honesty, I told them, is a fragile gift, and silence allows lies to grow like weeds. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I paused at the shattered altar. The golden light caught the dust floating in the air, turning each particle into a tiny spark of memory. I thought of all who had been hurt, all who had sought hope in a place that could not sustain it, and all who carried the lessons forward. African folktales often end with a warning, and this one is no different. Silence has a price, lies cannot be buried forever, and truth must be spoken before it is too late. The House of Everlasting Light had fallen, but it still taught, warning anyone willing to listen. And as the last rays of sun disappeared behind the horizon, I whispered one final time, heavy with truth and memory. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to leave a comment and tell us what you learned from this story.